So some of you who have been following along here might be thinking to yourself, okay, well, I get where you're going with this conversation. In fact, this is something that I've heard before, and it sounds an awful lot like the kind of messaging that you might get from some kind of popular thinking guru like Tony Robbins or, that kind of ilk, where we can understand that there's a mechanism by which we can basically, through the power of thought, create realities that are different than what we currently enjoy, and as such, find that as a tool to seek, prosperity or status or what have you, or things that we currently find lacking in our lives now. All right. And I would have to say, if you have come to that conclusion, I'm very sorry because I have not communicated things very well. Because what I am discussing here is radically different than that. Now, I do understand that that kind of Tony Robbins kind of stuff is very popular in a lot of circles that have language that overlap what I'm trying to discuss here, but they share nothing in common. Okay, in many ways. First of all, they certainly are very self-oriented, thinking that the self is something that exists in and of itself rather than what we are suggesting here, that the self is something that is experienced by an underlying substrate. That's radically different. As such, our interests are more in the underlying substrate than in ourselves. So even the task of seeking some kind of prosperity or status, for somebody that's interested in the underlying substrate, well, that's a pretty minor concern. If it comes incidentally, well, that might be all right. But in fact, we are more interested in the underlying substrate than we would ever be interested in power or success or anything of that nature. Um, Now, this natural misunderstanding uh, is one that is anticipated by practitioners here, and that's why very often, because of the perception of the potentiality for abuse of the message by individuals who were not particularly thoughtful or were straight up exploitive, there was a tendency to kind of keep this material quiet, and for good reason. Um, I think that those days are over. I think it's not at all harmful now, with the amount of information that's accessible to basically everybody, to provide clarification of what a lot of this is getting to in the simplest of terminology, so one can understand the difference. That's what I'm trying to do. Um, but plainly put, magical techniques, if used exploitively, are not constructive at least, and dangerous at worst. And the reason for that I will share with you, and it should be quite self-evident once you think about it. Okay, so let's put this as an example in the context of therapy. Again, I'm anticipating here because I've heard this kind of crap from various kinds of spiritual leaders too, who will say, oh, my techniques can be dangerous if misused. I don't know, because your kundalini might get in a twist or something of that nature. They don't really explain why. Um, again, I'm not going there. I want to diffuse that. No, like there's real reasons here that you should be concerned. Okay, so like if we're using a model here, again, that the self that we exist as is an experience being held by underlying substrate that is a contributive effort of a number of influences. Okay, guess biologic tendencies, prejudices, instincts, and the rest. All right. We may imagine those things as having personalities because the imagery is useful and it helps us to create language that can communicate between these hierarchical tiers of complexity. It's hard for us as the conscious bus driver, the experience of the whole, to have a conversation with the primal aspects of our being using logic, ethics, and who knows what, because those primal aspects of our being don't speak that, right? But we don't need to go that far down the tiers here. Let's just say that you have an aspect of your life that is seated in some kind of childhood trauma, because most everybody has had some kind of childhood trauma, that is burdensome to you, and you would like to resolve it somehow, okay? And that there is a tendency or a learned behavior in you somewhere that was cemented by an event that you had when you were 3 or 4 years old, okay, that you still carry the legacy of today, and you would like to remedy this, all right? Well, imagine what it would take, okay? Let's say that you had a 3-year-old kid who maybe, how about this, had a fear of dogs because they got bit by a dog when they were 3 years old, okay? Like, this would be a great example of something, and it doesn't have to get into some of the more loaded kinds of things that we would deal with. And let's say that this fear that the 3-year-old child has in the adult turned into a phobia, which is burdensome and something that you would rather not be afflicted by, okay? So through the idea of magical practice, the idea that you would find from this heritage, the kind of technique that you would find is somehow or another, you have to kind of rather raise the avatar of this personality aspect, okay, to the level of conversation with you, some kind of avatar of this 3-year-old child, and have a conversation with the 3-year-old child that is persuasive enough that the child can overcome their fear of animals and be persuaded that it's not necessary, in spite of the very real fact that they were bit and injured. Okay? Now imagine the difficulty in doing that with a real 3-year-old kid, like a son or a daughter who has been bit. Imagine the kind of effort that it's going to take to persuade a kid that's actually bitten by an animal. Okay? That can happen, but it doesn't happen all the time. And dogs are usually not dangerous, but you should be careful with them. And it's okay to be afraid of them at times and careful, but generally speaking, if you do so, you can enjoy the company of dogs very typically, and it is safe. Imagine the kind of conversation that you would have with a child. Okay? Now, I got to tell you, I, in the past, have worked with kids that have experienced tremendous childhood trauma. Okay? If there is a characteristic that is held universally by individuals who have experienced harm, it is skepticism. Okay? If you've literally been burnt by something, or bit by something, or injured by something, you have a tendency to have skeptical stink eye about being told otherwise, because you know full well that you've been hurt and you don't ever want to have it happen again. Okay? So it is absolutely critical that if you're getting into the conversation with this, say, 3-year-old child, whether real or projected, that the authenticity is absolutely 100% ironclad. It's absolutely undeniable. Okay? Because otherwise, all you can communicate is a layer of suspicion into where there is already fear. And if you were to just come at a 3-year-old child and give them some song and dance about how they don't need to worry about things and how their fears are something that they can forget about, and basically not deal with it with any kind of respect, but just thinking you can pep talk the kid out of their very real fear, legitimate fear of being bitten again, if you think you can just positive think your butt out of that stuff, you are wrong. In fact, you are likely to entrench the fear in skepticism and suspicion. That's what you're likely to do. Unless you're in a position where you can come at that stuff very, very, very honestly, you run the real risk of making things much worse. Internally, externally, with real kids or kids that you imagine into existence in your own experience. So it's really essential, in spite of the literature that says otherwise, when we involve ourselves in this kind of stuff, even though a lot of it can be rather fantastic and fanciful, okay, in practice, that we don't Harry Potter ourselves into some kind of belief that waving magic wands, believing things, or wishing things to be has any potency whatsoever, because it does not. And for people that are legitimate practitioners who are conversant in what we're discussing here, that would never be suggested. Not even people like Aleister Crowley suggests that. To quote Crowley, if you want to manifest a hole in the ground, use a shovel. Okay? Even Crowley will say that to you. The rest is nonsense. Now, without a doubt, assuming that if you want to change your world and your life in accordance with what your will might be, to use that terminology, your true will, that of the conscious bus driver, okay, that's going to always require action, not silly thinking. Okay? So the role here in the magical practice is to act better. Okay? And more powerfully, and more authentically, and more constructively, and towards ends that are more valuable. That's the point. But you are going to act. That is how things make themselves manifest, not through just some kind of conjuring out of the blue, okay? That's critical that we understand that action is essential. Again, certainly these practices can make the actions that you might undertake much more effective, but without action, to suggest even that things can happen without action, but only through force of will and thought, nah, that's just silliness. And that's not really part of the literature. That's part of fantasy. In fact, really, once one starts to contemplate the consequences and the cascade of ramifications from adopting this worldview, this kind of popular Tony Robbins, Harry Potter, who knows what kind of magical thinking stuff, like, it doesn't even make any sense to an individual who is pursuing this path authentically. Like, once you understand that it is most likely that you are the manifestation of an experience as you encounter it, of a larger, very complex, profound substrate, your interest necessarily turns towards the substrate. And as you pursue your interest and knowledge of the substrate, your motivations change. Okay? And to think that you want to be seeking power and prosperity and status and things of that nature through any of these efforts? No, not at all. What you find as you go along is more and more you seek connection and knowledge. That's what's important. connection, and knowledge. What else is there once you adopt this point of view? Anyway, stuff to chew on again. I thought I'd lay that out there. Thank you for following along. If there's any questions or things I'm leaving out, leave them in the comments. Cheers.